For most people, the Viking arrives in the imagination already finished. Tall, blonde, pale-eyed, ethnically sealed off from the rest of the world. A warrior from the cold north, carrying some supposedly ancient and unbroken Scandinavian essence. It feels old, traditional, like the kind of image that must have come directly from the Viking Age itself. It didn't. That picture is much newer than most people realize. In large part, it was assembled in the 19th century, when European nationalism was busy manufacturing heroic pasts for modern nations. This was the age when states, scholars, artists, and political movements all went searching for deep ancestral symbols figures they could turn into proof of national character. And the Vikings were perfect raw material for that project. They were dramatic. They were feared. They had left behind sagas, weapons, ships, and a trail of memory across Europe. But memory is not the same as accuracy. Once nationalism got hold of the Viking image, it stopped being just a historical subject and became something much more useful, a racial icon. Suddenly, the Viking was no longer presented as a member of a messy, mobile, interconnected world. He was recast as the embodiment of a pure northern type. Strong, fair, expansionist, and above all, distinct. Museums helped reinforce it. Popular art fixed the look. Textbooks simplified it. The result was an image that felt ancient, even though much of it had been filtered through very modern political desires. And that matters, because once a myth gets repeated through institutions, it stops feeling like myth. It starts to feel like common sense. So here's the first crack in the whole structure. Pop quiz: what hair color was actually most common in the Viking Age? If your mind immediately jumps to blonde, that's exactly the response the modern myth trained you to have. Blonde hair became almost shorthand for authentic Viking, as if pigmentation itself could certify historical identity. But the reality was never that clean. The Viking world was not a frozen ethnic capsule, and even its most iconic physical traits were far less uniform than later storytellers wanted them to be. This is where the old image begins to wobble. Because the more historians, archaeologists, and eventually geneticists looked closely, the less that tidy racial portrait held up. Not every Viking Age person looked the way 19th century nationalism said they should. Not every community in Scandinavia was isolated. Not every person participating in Viking activity came from the same ancestral background. And not every symbol of Vikingness pointed to bloodline. That last point is crucial. The old myth depends on the idea that identity is inherited cleanly, that you are born into it, carry it in your body, and display it outwardly in some visible package. Hair color, skull shape, ancestry, region. It is a deeply modern way of flattening people, and it gets especially misleading when projected backward onto the early medieval world. Because the Viking Age was not built on modern racial logic. It was built on movement, trade, raiding, marriage, slavery, diplomacy, migration, alliance, imitation, and adaptation. In other words, exactly the kind of human contact that tends to blur the boundaries nationalists prefer to sharpen. And yet the sharpened version won for a very long time. It survived because it was useful. A pure Viking was easier to celebrate than a complicated one. Easier to paint, easier to teach, easier to fold into stories about national greatness and civilizational identity. Complexity is harder to turn into propaganda. Mixture is harder to mythologize. So the mixed, changing, permeable reality of the Viking world was pushed to the edges while the blonde warrior took center stage. But once you see that image for what it is, a 19th century fabrication dressed up as ancient truth, you start asking a different question. If the Viking was not a pure and isolated biological type, then what exactly was he? And once ancient DNA entered the story, that question stopped being theoretical, because researchers would eventually test it at a scale no earlier generation could have imagined, and the results did not just weaken the old myth. They broke it open. The real collapse of the old Viking image began when researchers stopped arguing only from artifacts, chronicles, and later interpretations, and started reading biological evidence directly from the dead. This was the turning point. A massive ancient DNA study gathered skeletal remains from across the Viking world and sequenced 442 genomes from individuals dated to the Viking Age and surrounding periods. Not from one village, not from one royal burial, not from one famous battlefield. From a wide geographic spread stretching across Europe and into regions connected to Viking movement, this mattered because older debates were often built on narrow samples. A single grave can be unusual, a single site can mislead, but when you start working at this scale, patterns become much harder to explain away, and the scale was only half the story. The real challenge was extraction itself. Ancient DNA is fragile. It degrades over time. It gets contaminated easily, and in many skeletons there is almost nothing usable left. So when geneticists attempt a project like this, they are searching for tiny surviving fragments of inherited information, often inside the densest parts of the body. One of the most valuable sources is the petrous bone, a hard part of the skull near the inner ear that can preserve DNA far better than more exposed skeletal material. Think of it as a biological vault. Even then, recovery is difficult. Everything has to be controlled, cleaned, checked, and compared. So when results emerge from a study this large, they carry unusual weight. Because now the question is not, can we imagine that Vikings were more mixed than the myth suggests? The question becomes, what does the genome-level evidence actually show? And this is where the old story starts coming apart very quickly. The popular image assumes Scandinavia had been something like a sealed ancestral reservoir, an isolated northern population that later exploded outward during the Viking Age, carrying a coherent biological identity into the rest of Europe. But the genetic picture was already far more entangled before the famous raids even began. The study found clear evidence of gene flow into Scandinavia from outside regions long before the Viking Age reached its peak. In plain language, that means populations in Scandinavia had not been sitting untouched in some ancestral deep freeze. People had been moving in. Mixing had been happening. The biological story was already complex before the long ships became legendary. That one point alone is devastating to the purity myth, because once outside ancestry is present in meaningful ways before the classic Viking expansion, the entire fantasy of the original unmixed Viking stock becomes much harder to defend. What nationalism had presented as timeless essence begins to look more like what history usually is: accumulation, contact, and change. But the study pushed further than that. It also showed that Viking-associated individuals were not genetically uniform across the Viking world. Different regions, different communities, even different burial settings could reflect different ancestry profiles. That means the term Viking cannot be treated as a neat biological label. It does not map cleanly onto one genome signature. There was no single master genetic template that every Viking fit into. And that is a problem only if you came in expecting race to do all the explanatory work. If instead you treat Viking identity as something shaped by mobility, networks, allegiance, and culture, the findings start making much more sense. A world built on trade routes, raiding corridors, coastal settlements, slave-taking, mercenary service, intermarriage, and political alliance should leave a mixed record. In fact, it would be stranger if it did not. This is the point where genetics stops merely adding detail and starts changing the frame of the conversation itself. Because DNA does not just tell us where some people's ancestors likely came from. It also reveals when our categories are too crude: Scandinavian, Viking, foreign, native. Those words sound solid until you compare them against hundreds of genomes and realize the lived reality was blurrier than the labels. The old myth told a simple story: a pure people moved outward. The evidence tells a harder story. A connected world produced identities that were never as biologically sealed as later centuries pretended. And once that door opens, even more unsettling cases begin to appear. Because the next discovery did not involve outsiders merely influencing Viking society from a distance. It involved people with no Scandinavian ancestry at all being buried as Vikings. If the earlier findings weakened the myth of the pure Viking, this next one cut much deeper. because now we are no longer talking about outside ancestry drifting gradually into Scandinavia over generations. We are talking about something more direct and more disruptive to the old worldview. Individuals with no detectable Scandinavian genetic profile being buried inside Viking cultural settings with full honors as if they belonged there completely. One of the most striking examples came from Britain, where researchers identified individuals associated with Viking burials whose ancestry pointed not to Scandinavia, but to the local population, specifically indigenous groups in the British Isles, including people linked to the Picts of Scotland. That matters enormously. The Picts, in older popular history, are often placed on the opposite side of the Viking story, the local people, the invaded, the people the Vikings fought, displaced, or absorbed. So, under the old racial model, the categories should stay clean. Viking on one side, Pict on the other. Conqueror here, native there. But the graves do not cooperate with that neat division. Instead, we find people of local ancestry buried in ways that signal participation in Viking culture, and in some cases, high-status participation. Not marginal figures. Not people dumped awkwardly at the edges of a foreign system. People integrated enough to be treated as insiders. This is where the entire conversation has to shift, because once a person with local ancestry can be buried as an elite Viking, Viking clearly cannot mean a fixed biological race. It has to mean something else, something social, something cultural, something that could be entered, and this is the pattern interrupt that changes everything. Viking was a job description, not a race. That line is a simplification, but it gets much closer to the truth than the blonde bloodline myth ever did. In the early medieval world, identities were layered. A person could be local by ancestry, regional by upbringing, and Viking by activity, allegiance, or social role. The word Viking itself is often tied not to ethnicity, but to a way of operating, raiding, seafaring, expeditionary violence, mobile power, participation in a certain kind of martial and commercial network. It described what people did, not just what they were born as. And once you understand that, the DNA evidence stops looking strange. It starts looking inevitable. Of course, a society built on movement would absorb outsiders. Of course, alliances, fosterage, marriage, enslavement, military service, and trade would pull local people into Viking communities. Of course, some of those people would rise in status. Identity in that world was not always inherited like a sealed certificate. It could be performed, recognized, rewarded, and eventually buried with honors. That does not mean ancestry became irrelevant. Biological background still existed. Kinship still mattered. Local memory still mattered. But the evidence suggests that Viking identity was not locked behind a genetic gate. It was permeable, and that is a much more unsettling conclusion than simply saying the Vikings were mixed, because mixed still sounds like a story about blood. What this evidence really points to is a story about membership. Who gets counted as one of us? Who gets armed, buried, commemorated, and remembered as part of the group? Who can cross from outsider to insider? Those are not just Viking questions, those are human questions. And in this case, the archaeological and genetic record answer them the same way, more fluidly than later nationalist myths allowed. So the Viking world was not just exporting people. It was also absorbing them. And once that becomes visible, another assumption starts to break as well. Because if Viking identity was flexible enough to include men of local ancestry in elite roles, then what about another category later, history treated as fixed and unquestionable? What about gender? Because one of the most famous Viking graves in the world would force scholars to confront that next. One of the most famous Viking graves ever found lay at Birka in Sweden. For a long time, it seemed to confirm exactly the kind of image people expected from the Viking world. A high-status warrior buried with weapons, horses, and the full visual language of military authority. This was not an ordinary grave. It carried all the signals scholars had learned to associate with elite martial identity: swords, arrows, gaming pieces, mounted animals. The kind of burial that tells you this person was not standing at the edge of power. They were close to it. And for years, the assumption felt automatic, male. Not because anyone had definitive proof at first, but because the grave fit the story historians had been trained to tell. Weapons meant warrior. Warrior meant man. The logic was so deeply embedded that the identity of the buried person was treated as settled, long before modern testing forced the issue back open. Then genetics entered the conversation. DNA analysis showed that the individual in the Birka grave was biologically female. That finding hit like a crack through stone. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the old interpretive habit was so strong. Suddenly, scholars had to confront an uncomfortable possibility. For generations, some archaeologists had not simply been reading graves. They had also been projecting expectations into them. The grave had always contained the same objects. What changed was the willingness to believe what those objects might mean when a woman was the one buried among them. Now, to be careful here, this does not automatically solve every debate about the exact role she held in life. High-status graves are complicated. Burial symbolism is not a direct video recording of a person's daily routine. Some details remain debated, as they often do in archaeology, but the central point is powerful enough on its own. One of the most iconic warrior burials in the Viking world belonged to a woman, and that forces a much wider rethinking of how rigid our categories really were. Because just as Viking was not a race, warrior may not have belonged inside the narrow modern box many people assumed. And then there is the Estonian mass grave, which pushes the story in a different direction. If Birka destabilizes our assumptions about gender and status, Estonia brings the Viking world down to something more intimate and more brutal. Family. In that grave, researchers identified multiple men buried together, and among them were 4 biological brothers. Pause on that for a moment. Not just 4 men from the same camp. Not just 4 allies. 4 brothers, tied by immediate kinship, caught in the same deadly event and deposited in the same burial context. The Viking warband, which can sound abstract in historical writing, suddenly becomes painfully concrete. This was not only a machine of raiding and expansion. In at least some cases, it was built from family units. Brothers fought together, traveled together, traveled together. That detail changes the emotional temperature of the story. We often imagine Viking expeditions as faceless flows of violence, anonymous crews spilling out of ships into the wider world. But kinship evidence reveals something far more human and far more dangerous. These groups could be networks of trust welded together long before battle began. Shared childhood, shared household, shared loyalties. A warband like that is not just militarily effective, it is socially dense. And that matters because it helps explain how Viking identity could be both flexible and cohesive at the same time. Flexible because outsiders could be absorbed. Cohesive because kinship still formed a powerful internal skeleton. That combination is easy to miss if you rely only on myth. The old stereotype gives you a single image, the Viking as a uniform type. But these graves show something more layered. A woman. In one of the most famous warrior burials, 4 brothers in a mass grave, far from home. Identity here is not collapsing into chaos. It is revealing structure, just not the structure later centuries expected. Not race alone, not gender assumptions alone, not even simple nationality alone. What you start seeing instead is a world held together by overlapping systems. Ancestry, yes, but also role, status, reputation, kinship, and cultural belonging. And once those layers come into focus, we can finally do what the older myth never allowed. We can stop asking whether someone was really Viking in the racial sense, and start asking a better question. How do we track assimilation without oversimplifying identity? That is where the framework comes in. So after all of this, we arrive at the real payoff. Not just that the old Viking myth was wrong. Not just that the blonde, isolated bloodline was a modern fabrication. But that we now need a better way to think about identity in the past. Especially when genetics, archaeology, and culture do not line up in simple ways. That is where the Cultural Assimilation Analysis Framework comes in. This is not a formula that magically removes uncertainty. It is a tool for avoiding bad conclusions. a way to track how people become part of a group without assuming that ancestry, culture, and social status are all the same thing. Here is the framework. First, biological ancestry. Where does the person's genetic profile place their deeper family background? Are they broadly local to the region? Do they show ancestry linked to another population? This matters, but only as one layer. DNA can tell us something important about descent. It cannot, by itself, tell us what identity a person lived. Second, cultural expression. How are they buried? What objects are placed with them? What clothing styles, weapons, ornaments, or rituals surround them? These are signs of participation in a cultural world. A person may be local by ancestry and still present fully inside a Viking material system. Third, social role. What was this person doing within that society? Warrior, trader, sailor, elite retainer, dependent, spouse, captive, migrant. This is one of the most overlooked layers. Because in many historical settings, identity is tied not just to origin, but to function. The person buried as a Viking may have become Viking through action and allegiance. Fourth, recognition by the community. This is the crucial test. However they began, were they treated as insiders? Were they buried with honor? Included in prestigious spaces? Remembered through the same symbolic language as the group itself? Assimilation is not just about self-identification. It is also about whether the community accepted that identity as real. Now apply that framework to what we just saw. The Scottish Pict buried with elite Viking signals may be local in ancestry, but culturally and socially integrated into the Viking world. Under the old myth, that looks like a contradiction. Under the framework, it is perfectly legible. Outsider by descent, insider by recognized role. The Birka grave works the same way in a different dimension. The old model asked, could a woman really be associated with this kind of warrior burial? The framework asks a better question. What do the burial signals, social meaning, and community recognition tell us about the role this person held? It moves us away from reflex and toward evidence. The Estonian brothers show another side of the system. Assimilation did not erase kinship. Viking groups could incorporate outsiders and still remain anchored by family bonds. So the framework prevents a different mistake too, the idea that once identity becomes flexible, it becomes meaningless. It did not. It was flexible, but structured. And that may be the most important lesson of all. Historical identities are often neither fixed nor fake. They are built, maintained, negotiated. Sometimes inherited, sometimes earned, sometimes imposed, sometimes adopted. The Viking Age did not erase ancestry, but neither did it reduce belonging to bloodline alone. That is why this DNA evidence matters far beyond Viking history. It gives us a sharper way to read the past whenever we see the same pattern. Outsiders entering a community, local people adopting foreign identities, and later generations retrofitting all of that complexity into a myth of purity. But history is rarely pure. It is usually human. And the Vikings, perhaps more than almost anyone, prove it. Subscribe to join our community of historical mythbusters.